Welcome. For today's sermon, I'd like to take you on a very quick tour of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I'd like to do it through the lens of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. And I'm actually going to ask the question, if each Gospel was a Frank Lloyd Wright building, what Frank Lloyd Wright building would it be? I think this might be an interesting way to gain a little perspective on the Gospels and some of the ways they're the same and some of the ways that they're different. So I'd like to start with the Gospel of Mark. And today's reading is from Mark, and Mark is in fact going to continue throughout all of this year because we're in year B of the lectionary cycle. So in churches that follow the lectionary, they're going to be reading from the Gospel of Mark all throughout this year. And many people also think that Mark is the first gospel. So what would the Frank Lloyd Wright building be if we wanted to think about the Gospel of Mark? And I remember something that my exegesis professor said when I was in seminary. She and her kids have a tradition where during the week leading up to Easter, they read through an entire gospel, start to finish, and they do this together. And so she asked her kids, she said, which gospel would you like to read this year? And the kids did not waste any time. They said, we want the Gospel of Mark. And she said, so why the Gospel of Mark? And they said, because it's the shortest. So they did indeed read all the way through the Gospel of Mark. But that is one thing that is true about the Gospel of Mark. It is the most compact gospel. And so if we were thinking of the Gospel of Mark as a Frank Lloyd Wright building, I think it would probably be a Usonian home. And I'm going to pick a particular one that I'm fond of, which is the Lawrence House in Rockville, Illinois. And the Lawrence House is a beautiful example of Usonian architecture. It is compact. It's designed to be affordable. Usonian homes were designed around the time of the Great Depression. And Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to design a house that anyone could afford, that could be made inexpensively, but yet would still be beautiful and wonderful and compelling. And the Lawrence House is particularly interesting because it is the only house that Frank Lloyd Wright designed for someone who needed wheelchair access. Because Mr. Lawrence was in fact using a wheelchair at the time that the house was designed. So the Lawrence House, it's small, it's compact, it's accessible, and these are things that are true of the Gospel of Mark as well. The Gospel of Mark is the most compact of the Gospels. It's also like a Usonian house where everything is near at hand and nothing is very far from anywhere else. The Gospel of Mark is also the Gospel of immediately. The author of Mark loves the word immediately. So scattered throughout the gospel, you will see Jesus did this, and then immediately there's someplace else. And Usonian homes are like that. Immediately, you're in the living room, and then immediately you're in the bedroom. And immediately, there's not a lot of different spaces or a lot of separation between the spaces in your home. So a Usonian home is a great sort of analogy for the Gospel of Mark. It's accessible, it's compact, everything is easily at hand. But if the Gospel of Mark is a Usonian home or the Lawrence House, what do we want to say the Gospel of Matthew is? And for me, the building that comes to mind when I think about the Gospel of Matthew is the Marin Civic Center in Marin, California. The Marin Civic Center is a beautiful building. It is built across rolling hills, and it's big and grand. It is much larger than a Usonian home. It is, in fact, a magnificent structure, and it's also a structure where people come together. And it's a structure that's meant to serve all people, people from diverse backgrounds. And that's very much something that is true of the Gospel of Matthew as well. They sometimes call the Gospel of Matthew the Gospel of Peace. So Blessed are the peacemakers. That's a very Matthew thing to say. And there's also something else about Matthew. It seems clear that when you're in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is often teaching in the synagogues, and it's sort of taken without needing to be explicitly restated that Jesus is Jewish, he teaches in synagogues, he hangs out, he celebrates Jewish holidays, but it's just sort of taken as part of what you would expect. In the Gospel of Matthew, we get the sense that maybe there's a little bit of discord going on. The Christian and Jewish communities, which start out as intermingled and close-knit, are starting to maybe separate a little bit. And there's this question of how Jewish Christians have to be and how Jewish Christianity wants to be. And the answer for the Gospel of Matthew is to be very explicit about including Jewish scripture and Jewish stories and making clear that this is a very Jewish gospel at the same time that it's a very Christian gospel. And so we get the sense that there's maybe some discord, and maybe the fact that Matthew is saying is blessed are the peacemakers is because in fact there's some peace that needs to be made in that community. But the Gospel of Matthew is going to try and do that. And in some ways that's not so different from the Marin Civic Center. The Marin Civic Center was a building that was initially sponsored by the County of Marin, but then some political opposition came up to this. Some people thought that Frank Lloyd Wright as an architect, well, they accused him of being too much of a socialist. And at the same time, they also accused him of being maybe too much of a capitalist, because he charged more than the other architects would charge. And yet the people of Marin came together against the opposition of their political leaders and said, we want this beautiful building. We want it built. We do not want you to stand in its way. And so there it is, across the beautiful mountains. And the Gospel of Matthew is also sometimes called the Gospel of Mountains because Jesus is often on a mountain or going to a mountain, and miraculous things happen on mountaintops. And when Jesus gathers a crowd to preach to them, he preaches on the mount. It's the Sermon on the Mount. And mountains are a very Matthew thing. And when Frank Lloyd Wright, I've heard, was hired to design the Marin Civic Center, they said, well, we've got this site for you, but we're kind of sorry, it's very hilly, but don't worry, we can get some bulldozers and we can flatten that for you. And Frank Lloyd Wright said, no, that's not what I want. I want to build a building that goes with the contours of the land, that goes with the contours of the hills and integrates with them and integrates into its landscape in a seamless fashion. Don't flatten those hills. We need them. And just so I think when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, this Gospel of Mountains, it's also a gospel that's meant to fit its own context. It's meant to fit the context of a community that's trying to decide what it wants to be, a community that maybe has some division, a community that needs peacemakers, needs people to come together, and needs to explicitly include all of the people that it wants to have included in this community. So that just like the Marin Civic Center is a building that is built to the contours of its land, the Gospel of Matthew is a gospel, like all the others, that is built to follow the contours of its community, to be what they need, to give them what they want. So I've said that I think the Gospel of Mark is maybe a Usonian home, maybe the Laurent House. And I've said that the Gospel of Matthew, I think that's the Marin Civic Center. But so what's the Gospel of Luke going to be? The Gospel of Luke has several characteristics that make it unique. One is that unlike the other Gospels, which sort of stand alone, the Gospel of Luke is part of a matched set. The same author, it appears, wrote both Luke and the book of Acts and introduces them the same way and uses similar language. So this gospel is not a standalone gospel. This is part of a set. Another thing about it is that this is a very academic gospel. It starts out with some very rich and flowery Greek, much more complicated than you'll find in the other gospels. And the author makes it very clear that this gospel was not written carelessly, that it is a carefully researched gospel, that the author took into account all of the sources and stories and resources that they could find to put together this gospel. So this is a very well-researched, academic, well-composed gospel. The Gospel of Luke is also sometimes called the Gospel of the Poor. And it's very clear reading it that Luke is on the side of the poor. And finally, it's sometimes called the Gospel of Women, because there are stories about women in Jesus' followers or in Jesus' parables, which don't occur in the other Gospels. So the story of Mary and Elizabeth and the beautiful poetry of the Magnificat, which talks about the poor being raised up and the hungry being filled, that's Gospel of Luke. And often in the parables, where there's a parallel that features a male protagonist, such as the tale of the shepherd and the 99 sheep and the one that has gone astray, it will be followed by a corresponding parallel with a female protagonist. So in Luke, the parable of the lost sheep is followed by the parable of the lost coin, one with a male protagonist, one with a female protagonist. And the Gospel of Luke also tells us that Jesus is supported by a group of women who travel with the disciples and make sure that their financial needs are taken care of and that support that community of disciples. So these are things which are unique to the Gospel of Luke. So now I just need to find a Frank Lloyd Wright building that is for the poor and for the women and is part of a match set and is also sort of academic and rigorous in its scholarship. And so for that, I think I would choose the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel at Florida Southern College. It's very much like the Gospel of Luke in that it is part of a set. It's part of a group of buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright designed for Florida Southern College. It's in an academic setting, which suits well Luke's scholarship and careful research and very well-constructed, beautiful language. In terms of recognizing the contribution of women, the fact that it is named after Annie Pfeiffer, a benefactor who gave $100,000 to facilitate the construction of the chapel, goes along with Luke's care to acknowledge the contributions of women and to recognize what they were doing and how they were supporting the community. Now, the Gospel of the Poor, that might seem like more of a stretch for this building. But the truth is, when the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel was being constructed, the university actually didn't have enough money to pay for the laborers to build it. So they made a deal with the students. And they said, if you will help us build the chapel, we will forgive your tuition. So this is a chapel which is built by students whose tuition was being forgiven so that the university could afford to build a beautiful building that it would not otherwise be able to have. So when we think about these three different buildings that I've talked about so far, the Laurent House, and the Marin Civic Center and the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel, each one of them has a set of shapes that sort of characterize it. If you think of the Usonian homes or the Laurent House, it's got a lot of squares and rectangles. This squares and rectangles, that's a motif that's repeated often. The Marin Civic Center has a different motif. It's all about curves and arches and circles. And then the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel is really about triangles. Triangles and then interesting shapes that triangles combined together could make. So each of these buildings has a shape associated with it. And when we think about the Gospel of John, there's a shape I associate with it. And that shape is the spiral. And what's interesting about the Gospel of John is the other three Gospels tell a story of Jesus, and they tell a story of Jesus traveling to Jerusalem. But in the Gospel of John, there's not one trip to Jerusalem. There are three. And so some scholars believe that it actually is all the same trip, but the way that the Gospel of John is written in such a way that it takes us on a journey, and then the journey expands and repeats, and we travel back and retrace the same area over and over again, and each time learning more and going deeper and becoming closer to the spirituality that is seeking to lead us to. So if a spiral is the shape of the Gospel of John, then I think the building that corresponds to that would be the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. This is a beautiful building that is not divided up into floors in a traditional way, but instead it is made in a spiral where you start at the bottom and you can just gradually ascend, going back and forth. And each time you return to the same place, you're actually at a higher level. And you can look across and see all the levels of the spiral, or you can look up and see the beautiful skylight. And that, to me, it feels very much like the Gospel of John, which doesn't have the same sort of outline or pattern as the other three Gospels do, but has perhaps a more open and spiritual feel to it, where it is drawing us again and again by telling us that same story three times to a higher level. One of the things I love about the four Gospels is how they're different, how they represent different perspectives and different communities, and how they don't always necessarily agree with one another. Matthew's focus might be on peacemakers. Luke's focus might be on the poor. John's focus might just simply be on an overarching spirituality that draws us closer to the light. And Mark is going to provide us what we need in the most effective and compact way, and Mark is going to do it immediately. So they're each different, but they're each beautiful in their own way. And if we think about Frank Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings are shaped by a common genius, but they are very diverse. Frank Lloyd Wright is not famous because he designed the same building over and over again. His fame and the beauty of his work is that it is so diverse. It serves diverse populations. It cleaves to different landscapes. It fulfills different needs. And even so, one of the things I really love about the Gospels is that they are different. They are serving different populations. They are cleaving to different landscapes and serving different communities. And so even as we come together with our differences and note that we're not all the same and maybe don't always agree on everything, we can take inspiration in the fact that the Bible has these beautifully wonderfully constructed works that are just as diverse and wonderful as we are. Amen.